Thank you very much. We will start with the questions, if I may, right away. You have experienced a lot. You are one of the most famous scholars in the world, and you have witnessed many serious events, being the war in Vietnam, the collapse of the Soviet Union, invasion of the United States and its allies in Iraq, Afghanistan. However, today, often we hear that the situation at the moment is actually the most serious as it was, the most threatening as it was after the Second World War. Do you share this opinion?
We certainly have really grave dangers. We also have good solutions to these if we keep our head on and if we're honest about the situation. Of course, there have been moments of absolutely immediate peril. I think back 61 years, and I remember it actually, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were just within a moment of nuclear war, and it was only extraordinarily wise leadership by President Kennedy and by Nikita Khrushchev that pulled the two countries back from the brink of complete disaster for the world. We're not standing at the edge exactly that way, but boy, are we creating risks like the war in Ukraine, which is really a war between the United States and Russia, though it's being fought in Ukraine by Ukrainians. It's a proxy war. And now this war in Gaza, which is a war fought by Israel, but made possible by the United States and is extremely dangerous. And the high tensions between the United States and China, which, again, I blame the United States for as the main reason. Add those up, it's a bad situation. But then add on top of that the fact that we have the man-made dangers of environmental destruction, climate change, pollution, destruction of our fisheries and our forests that is very serious, very far along, and even denied by many political leaders. We still have political leaders who are scientifically ignorant, who aggressively deny what is absolutely facing us, which is terrible destabilization of the physical systems for our food supplies, our forests, our fisheries, and so forth. So you add this all up, it's a terribly difficult and bad time. And maybe what makes everyone so nervous on top of it is that the quality of political leadership is extremely low. Our president is 81 years old and should be in retirement. This is absolutely obvious. Our Congress is quite corrupt in the United States because we have a system of campaign financing that depends on billions and billions of dollars going from big companies to the congressmen and senators. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. There's a great deal of instability, and our political leaders don't know how to get along with each other. So you add this all up, it's definitely bad. Whether it's absolutely the worst, it's a little hard to judge, but it's bad enough that we ought to do something about it.
You actually mentioned many questions that I was going to ask, but if I understand correctly, how did we get there actually? So definitely there is some kind of crisis of leadership, because I believe that the problem is not only a senior American president, these problems can be also in other countries. Then, of course, there's a concentration of unprecedented crises. And of course, there is a part, I would say, that's considering the decisions that the superpowers make Would you agree with this combination?
I think if I could put one word on the reason we're in this crisis, it is arrogance. Arrogance of the rich and the powerful. And the United States was the richest and the most powerful of all during this period. So the arrogance of the United States has been extremely notable. You know, when the Cold War ended in 1989 in Central Europe and in 1991 in the former Soviet Union, we might have said, now we have a glorious opportunity for peace, for cooperation, and for prosperity. This didn't happen. It could have happened. I was there. I saw what could have been done. Instead, the United States said, we won, we're the best, we're the most powerful, we don't have to deal with anybody except on our own terms. And the United States absolutely went from arrogant to hyper arrogant and said, we can do what we want, where we want. And strangely enough, though the United States basically faced no security threats after that time, it went to war more often than ever. Of course, it completely misjudged two things. One, it continued to think of Russia as a natural enemy, and so it actually created a new enemy, because I was advisor to Gorbachev, I was advisor to Yeltsin. They wanted absolute peace and normal relations. There's no doubt in my mind. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a plot. It was an attempt to create normal relations. The United States instead said, oh, no, we won. We won. Now we'll move NATO. Okay, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland. Oh, we'll keep moving. We'll go to the Baltics. We'll go to Romania, Bulgaria. We'll go to the Balkans. Oh, no. We'll go to Ukraine. We'll go to Georgia. We'll surround Russia. We'll decolonize Russia. That's a term used in American political circles. Even saying, oh, Russia should be dismembered now. Well, what on earth are these people thinking? Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, a powerful army, a self-respect, and a desire for its own security. And so the United States provoked what absolutely it should not have provoked. So this was a part of the issue. A second part of the issue is that, in general, the rich became arrogant in a different way, saying, oh, we're so good. We used to be millionaires. Now we're billionaires. We don't have to share anything. So they became libertarian in philosophy. Libertarian in American philosophy means we don't have to pay taxes because what we have is ours and nobody's going to take it away. And so we developed a super rich class that became very self-righteous. That's my money. It's nobody else's money. How dare the government think to take it? And at the same time, a growing amount of people struggling in poverty or losing jobs to technology, being replaced by robots, being replaced by automation. So the gap in our society between the rich and the poor widened considerably. And this was the second factor. And you would think that in a political democracy, the poor people would vote out the ones that are leaning on them, or would vote for tax increases on the small group of very powerful. But that theory is wrong, because the small group of very powerful buy the politicians. They really do. And so they pay the campaign contributions. And the first rule of the US Congress is vote tax cuts for companies and rich individuals. So that is the second thing that happened. The third thing that happened is that the environmental crises, especially the climate change crisis, came and would require changes in our behavior and would also cause limitations to the big energy industry, the oil, the gas, the coal industry. And the industry resisted those changes, said no. And the politicians said, oh, it's not even real. Like Václav Klaus and others, they just denied the climate change. And this denial has gone on for decades. Actually, we just saw a new president of Argentina elected just now, who said that climate change is a socialist plot. You can't even make this up. I don't know whether this is just playing games to get elected, whether it's complete sheer ignorance, whether it's corruption. I don't know what it is, but it's shocking. People in any kind of responsibility should know better. They should at least understand what this issue is about. And this has been a very big challenge. It's, again, part of the arrogance. I happen to lead a scientific institute at Columbia University with hundreds of climate scientists. So I had an earful all the time about the climate science. Many people don't have that chance to hear directly. So they hear from politicians or actors who want to be politicians, who say whatever they feel like. And the result is that we go decade after decade without solving these problems, despite all the meetings, the treaties, the conferences, and so forth. So when you add all of this up, as I said, I think the underlying problem is arrogance of the rich and the powerful, who somehow think the rules don't apply to them. And we end up in a world that is in conflict. We end up in a world that is divided between rich and poor. We end up in a world that is facing massive environmental crises. And it's all so weird because the world's richer than ever before, better technologies than ever before. And we could, if we chose right, move to peace immediately. I just testified in the UN Security Council about 4 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Palestine, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa, which is Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. And I pointed out all 4 of these huge wars could be stopped tomorrow with politics, with basic sound politics. But our leaders are just incapable of basic sound politics, unfortunately.
When you mentioned arrogance and the beginning of the 90s, well, I am from the Czech Republic, as you know, myself. So,
of course.
Yes, we have vast experience with neoliberal policies and their application. However, I wanted to ask about liberal democracy. Of course, we have to mention Francis Fukuyama and his end of history. And now we see how completely wrong that was. But do you see also the liberal democracy as something that maybe hides more the true state of affairs than actually helps to resolve the conflicts? Because, when scholars like Martin Wolf suggest that maybe instead of voting, we should have some, choice by chance randomly, that would be better than elect the representatives that we have. There's certainly something wrong. So maybe if you could elaborate on the liberal democracy, and maybe it really will be an end, but the question is what kind of end it will be.
It would be great if we could make democracy work, because democracy is very attractive in principle. It's a way for free people to express themselves. It's a way for people to participate. It's a way for people to learn about social and political realities. So it, in principle, is a very attractive system. And in general, it's a way for people to have protection from their own governments, because non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. probably they'll meet in elections next year, probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society, some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. Speaking of the United States, we have two leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate. And I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how, when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the US lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the US wanting to expand NATO. And of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the US provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the US went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know, because many Europeans told me many times, oh, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. But then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, they're afraid of the US. They shouldn't be afraid of the US. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy, and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, "Oh, they don't take us seriously in Washington." And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. And this should be the approach, but it's not the approach.
We see from this election in Argentina, we see Iran deepening its economic ties with Russia now with this free trade agreement, but also linking itself to China. We see the wider Eurasian integration. We see now Russia's economic return to the Middle East, as we also in Saudi Arabia and UAE. This is quite putting on a bit of a spectacular show. And if we have time, of course, we'd like to look also at some of the solutions, if it's possible, to some of the economic and political challenges today, such as the sustainability of U.S. debt and the stability of the dollar, which I guess while many would like to see it had a lower or more weaker status in the world, collapse would be horrible probably for everyone. So, but if you don't mind, I thought we could start with Argentina, because for me this case is very strange. A hard time making sense of it. Obviously, Argentina has a lot of problem with inflation and other economic problems, so I can understand the appetite for radical reforms. But the election of Javier Milei is very radical, I think, even radical for Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. So how do you interpret this? Why has Argentina had so many economic problems to begin with, and what do you make of his solutions? Are they accurate solution to this problem?
The story of Argentina goes back 2 centuries. This is a very complicated place that has added more zeros to the price level than any other country in the world. Its next door neighbor, Brazil, comes in second. So Argentina, in the course of its 2 centuries of independence, has done everything you can do to money, period. It's had new currencies, old currencies, depreciated currencies, hyperinflations repeatedly, defaults repeatedly. So it's kind of a mystery at some fundamental level why such a well-resourced country, many educated people, a country that was one of the richest in the world a century ago, has been in so much tumult. And when I was studying economics 50 years ago, as I began my freshman year at university, the great economic historian of the day in Harvard University was a man named Simon Kuznets, who invented to a substantial extent the national income accounts, the GDP and the other parts of the national income accounts, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. But he, maybe apocryphally, but the story was that he opened his course each year saying there are 4 types of countries. There are the developed economies, there are the developing economies, there is Japan, and there is Argentina. Now, what that meant was, at the time, Japan was the miracle economy. We would say that maybe about China now. And Argentina already, this was 50 years ago, was the country constantly in crisis. So one of the things about crisis is that if you have had repeated financial crises, you are prone to having more of them, because everybody is always on guard to get out of the national currency before it loses all value. So Argentina is a country of macroeconomists. The taxi driver is a macroeconomist. The storekeeper is a macroeconomist. They all have dollars and pesos. They're always ready. They're looking every moment. Will there be a political crisis? Will our currency lose value? And you end up with a lot of self-fulfilling catastrophes. A self-fulfilling catastrophe is when something bad happens because something bad is expected to happen. And if the currency is expected to lose value, then people flee the currency and drive down its value, thereby confirming the fear. And in certain circumstances, with fragile economies, and Argentina is the most classic case, that fear becomes self-confirming on an ongoing basis. And I can tell you a story. I was trying to help not the previous finance minister, but the finance minister just before him, a man named Martin Guzman, a professional, a very decent man. And he was battling an inflation rate of 40 or 50% per year. And Argentina had a large debt. But actually not, I shouldn't even say that. It had a relatively small debt, but since nobody trusts Argentina, no one would lend it new money. So as the old debt was coming due, a government would normally borrow new money to pay off the old money and keep the debt level pretty much the same. But Argentina has no friends, nobody trusts it. So as the Argentine debt was coming due, everyone wanted to be repaid, thank you, no more loans. So I was trying to help, since part of my work over the last 40 years has been in economic emergencies, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with their bank creditors, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with the International Monetary Fund. And I said, oh God, this is tough. Nobody believes in Argentina, least of all the Argentines. So after these agreements were reached, I flew to Buenos Aires and I met in a large room with Argentina's PUBAs, the powers and shakers. And I said, you know, your situation is not as bad as you think. Your debt is actually not so high. Your need for the central bank to print money is actually not so high. It's just that nobody trusts you. So if we could regain trust, believe me, you know, your balance sheet is actually better than the US government. It's just that in the US, everybody uses the dollar, so you could run big budget deficits. But Argentina's budget deficit was smaller than the US, and Argentina's inflation soared because everyone was always ready to run out of the peso. Okay, so I said, just rebuild trust. I felt pretty good. Compelling speech, showed the data, showed that the US is worse at a fundamental level than Argentina. Flew home, and within days, the finance minister basically resigned because his own political party more or less disowned him after he had gotten these agreements. Oh my God, okay, he's gone. Inflation soars again. And so all that handiwork of saying, you know, there's a way to get out of this, be careful, evaporated, and the inflation eventually rose to more than 100% per year, which is pretty high, although I've dealt with countries in thousands of percent per year. But it was sufficiently high that the Argentines said in this election, we don't want to hear anything about any standard politician. We want something completely new. And the incoming president promised something completely new, specifically to adopt the dollar. And it's probably not going to happen because quickly they backtrack. We don't even have dollars. We can't tie our future to a currency in which we have no reserves. We couldn't back the banking system and so forth. I've not spoken with the new government, although I know the incoming finance minister quite well. I plan to speak with them. The long and the short of it is this is just chronic crisis. So I wouldn't draw too much about general facts from Argentina, because basically almost any time between 1823 And 2023, you could have found the country in crisis. And I've dealt with already in my career with a number of presidents of Argentina, and they don't have the internal political capacity to overcome this yet. So all of this is to say, Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS. And that is a good thing and an important thing for Argentina, because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist. So on the American side of this bloc politics, my message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. Don't go with the U.S. in this sense. Trade with the U.S., trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the U.S. is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is, you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi Arabia,
I didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting
very
part.
It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook the hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The new Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that, you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western-based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC Plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle, is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices, or at international prices, larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year in particular is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken US policies on the dollar. So the US has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the US a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina, where everyone's sitting on the edge as the US debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the US being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege, that you get to borrow, you can pump up the money supply, you get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the US just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really been, it's become an addiction. The US generally is addicted to regime change. The US generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the US figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars. Thank you. Your dollars literally means you have accounts in US banks or US controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the US has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the US influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro's no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserve? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so, but that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the US banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we could trade with China and renminbi. We could trade with India and rupees. Little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy. The ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, and so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, just a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested. Of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926 that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport, which he had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And, of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member, why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical. And we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson.
Of the staff, and I tell them often, that's not what you learned in class. So I'm trying to help them do the right thing. But that's a power situation also, obviously. So to answer your question, first of all, there is no definitive answer to this. Second, so how big approximately? Somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion a year. Okay, now, is that a lot or a little? The world output is $100 trillion a year. The world saving is $30 trillion a year. So we're talking about 3 to 5% of world GDP. And we're talking about maybe, 10% to 16.6% of global saving. Perfectly manageable. And saving isn't fixed, it could rise and so forth. So the gaps are not huge. They're quite manageable, given that these are our major global goals. And certainly the gaps for the poorest countries are not at all big. Maybe $1 trillion a year. And $1 trillion a year is 1% of world output. And if you gave me $1 trillion a year, I would be able to help every government get out of poverty. That would be enough to make investments, get all the kids in school, get health care for every person, get water and electricity connection for every person. That'd be a great start. And you could do that for $1 trillion a year for all the billion people in extreme poverty. So it's not huge. So then comes lots of detailed, interesting analytical questions. First, some of it is for rich countries, but the gap there isn't really a financing gap, it's a political choice gap. They're just not making investments, but the finance is available. Where the gap is really most consequential is for countries that cannot mobilize this out of their domestic resources. A poor country cannot afford to get all its kids in school, by the way. This is very weird, because you'd think, well, at least you can do that. But I've spent 10 years on this calculation. And if you're a low-income country, it costs between 10 and 15% of GDP for universal primary and secondary education. Very high. The reason is teachers are relatively costly in low-income countries, and there are a lot of young kids in low-income countries because they have high fertility rates, so the whole age pyramid is very wide. So there's not an African country, low-income or lower middle-income country, that can actually afford SDG 4. And that should be the most alarming fact in the world, because you cannot have economic development without your kids educated. No matter what else you do, you cannot have economic development without educated kids. So it's for the low and lower middle income countries that the crisis is biggest. There are gaps in the high income countries, but I don't worry too much about them because those are political obstacles that should be filled, but it's manageable. Upper middle income is tricky because some upper middle income countries have good access to credit, others don't have access to credit. Then there's another consideration. Sorry, and I'll come to a conclusion. Technically, what do? There are two related issues. One, how could you make capital flow at relatively low cost and long-term maturity to poorer countries? This is the major technical question on finance. If you look at the penalties that low-income countries pay to borrow, they're quite steep. You pay 10 or 15% interest rates if you are a double B borrower, sub-investment grade, compared to what a triple A or double A minus borrower pays. And why is that? Long story, and I won't go into it, but making that flatter so that for poor countries they have access to low-cost capital is crucial. One way to do that is larger multilateral development banks. Everybody agrees on that, though they don't agree to do it, but they agree that that's one part of the solution. More ADB, more AIIB, more new development bank, more World Bank. That requires capital increases. Capital increases mean larger voting shares for China. The United States needs to swallow, and Europe needs to swallow and get on with it. So that's one part of what needs to be done. The second part is to de-risk private capital flows. That's also a tricky set of issues. I'd say I got into that question 45 years ago as a graduate student, and it's still somewhat of a puzzle. It's a long story, but it's not impossible to do that. There's one more dimension, and because also you're from the Russian Federation, I want to mention it, and that is that there's an intrinsic link between global finance and global monetary arrangements. And global monetary arrangements mean how we settle trade. And we are, of course, in a largely dollar-based settlements system. So the monetary system is largely dollar-based, not exclusively, but about 60%. And the United States, unfortunately and unwisely, weaponized the dollar-based payment system starting about 15 years ago by seizing assets, including Russian assets recently, the $300 billion seized in 2022, but also Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and a number of others. To my mind, this is a completely unacceptable and self-defeating policy. It's cheap because the President of the United States can do it with a stroke of the pen. You don't have to ask Congress, you don't have to ask the public, you don't have to ask the UN, you don't have to ask anybody. To my mind, it's blatantly illegal and absolutely practically unwise. Because why would you use dollars if the US is going to take them away from you when they don't like what you're doing? The idea of payments is that they're reliable, not that they're political. So this is why the BRICS countries, especially under Russia's leadership this year, are negotiating non-dollar payments. And I support this entirely. But I also say to the US Treasury all the time, don't confiscate other people's money. It's not a good policy. It's not going to work. And the idea, by the way, of grabbing Russia's $300 billion for Ukraine is so illegal you don't even know where to start. But these are politicians. They're not lawyers, they're not diplomats, they're not financiers. They want quick solutions for their re-elections. So this is really a problem. But it's a problem that also has a solution because we just won't use the dollar in places where the United States policies could lead to confiscation. So all of this means we have a bit of a morass in the international financial system within our family of getting the right answers to the financing questions. There's actually one more technical point I need to mention, which is that the IMF and the World Bank have what they call the Debt Sustainability Framework, or DSF. And it's based on an arbitrary set of numbers where they say, we grade you whether you're weak, medium, or strong in debt management. And then based on your ranking, we give you a ceiling of gross debt to GDP. And the ceiling is no more than 30% debt to GDP ratio if you are a weakly governed country. This is a death certificate. This is not economic policy. Why? Because if you're a poor country, it means almost by definition you don't have electricity, you don't have paved roads, you don't have digital access, and your kids aren't in school. So what the IMF and the World Bank are telling you is, stay that way. Don't bother us. Don't borrow because you might get into debt trouble. But if you don't borrow, you won't have electricity, schools, or anything else. They don't have an alternative solution for these countries. So they're telling the countries, don't borrow. I'm telling the countries borrow. But my advice is borrow 30-year maturity, fixed interest rates, and on reasonable terms. But where do you get those? That's where I want the G20 to come into this story to give an answer to that. But when I do, again, in my spare time, solving a growth model for how much you should borrow if you want to have your kids in school, have electricity and so on, exactly your question, the debt actually rises to about 200% of GDP before it starts declining 30 years from now. You want to borrow a lot because you don't want to live without electricity, you don't want to live without roads, you don't want to live without educated children, you don't want to live without health facilities. So you want to borrow, but you want the borrowing to be very long term so that you have 40 years to grow in order to repay the debt 40 years from now. The IMF has none of this intertemporal analysis because the debt sustainability framework is a 5-year snapshot. It's not a growth scenario. Now, I taught intertemporal growth for 30 years, and this is where I tell my students, you learn something, right? You borrow if the rate of return on your investment is higher than the cost of capital, and if you're not going to get into a debt crisis in the meantime. So we need to create a finance framework that can work. Final words. For this region, SCAP, there are a few countries that are seriously debt constrained or finance constrained. Most are not, but some are. For Africa, it's pervasive. The whole continent is debt constrained right now. So that's where the most serious problems are. Within this region, you have the means to solve the problem because this is a high saving region. And China has a saving surplus. That's why initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative are wonderful. And they should really be encouraged. But the advice I give to China is when you lend for the Belt and Road Initiative, lend for 30 years. Don't lend for 10 years or 12 years. You will be disappointed and your counterpart will be very disappointed because they'll get into debt crisis. And that's what's happening right now. Not that China set a debt trap, that's propaganda. China didn't set a debt trap, it just set a maturity structure too short. And so when I speak to the Chinese finance authorities, I'm telling them 30-year loans. And nobody thinks ahead more than China. So China needs to do the same thing of looking at a 30-year perspective, and especially for the poorer countries, give much longer term loans. And for the rest of the US, unfortunately, is not a net savings surplus country, it's a net debtor country, so it can't offer much in finance anymore. But the capital markets could offer more, and we need to tap that. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but very good question, important question.
Make a difference here. I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point. And it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900-kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008, by God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it. Because this is a game. The game is Nuland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know, I
Okay?
think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of, you know, beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, you know, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way, if I may just,
weapons.
if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, you know, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back, and now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, yeah, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it, stop, don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this, NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in 2019,
but just
Ukraine
to say,
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, will you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, Georgia's the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military-industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon.
Jeffrey Sachs,
Yes.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, yes, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. The first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the U.S. is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you, I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the U.S. grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up, and they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point when he said and realized that Russia has what's called escalatory dominance. What that means is Russia can meet us and raise the bet. Because for Russia, this is existential. For us, it's another war. Okay, we're going to expand NATO here. We're going to expand NATO there. We're going to do whatever we want to do. For Russia, they view this as the essence of Russia's national security. They have 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Obama realized this, said, I don't want to even start down this path. I don't know what this administration is doing. They have no plan. It's phony. And phony in the sense that they have no route to success, but they're in it up to their necks right now. Worse than that, for Ukraine, they're in it above their heads. They're drowning in this violence. We've got to stop the fighting, because there is no military path to victory, because Russia can escalate, and can escalate to devastation. And we're told, oh, don't say that, don't mention nuclear weapons and so forth. You know what? Mention them. Understand.
Yes, and I think we should also mention, Jeffrey Sachs, that the United States has a nuclear posture review, the Biden administration, that says we will use nuclear weapons first if our allies' interests are threatened. So, who's going to use them first, or will they be used? All of this is speculation, but it's frightening that we are escalating right now, training Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets that could
after they said again
Russia.
and again that they wouldn't do it, they keep taking the next step.
it's time for the Newland administration really to step down so that we can have peace and have some sanity. How would the Biden administration think about Russia establishing military bases in Mexico? Probably not thrilled. They probably wouldn't say, well, that's Mexico's choice. What are we going to do about it? So a little bit of thinking and empathy might have gone a long way. But we have heard almost nothing about it in your expertise, which I'm just amazed at day by day how the New York Times and other mainstream media twist all of this. I recently asked an assistant of mine, please do a scan for the last 2 years of the editorial pages of the New York Times. 26 times the idea of unprovoked invasion has been raised by the New York Times in its editorials, in its opinion columns of the New York Times columnists like Tom Friedman and others, and in the invited op-eds. And you just can't get a word in otherwise. You can't tell that readership you were just describing in Manhattan, where I happen to live, what's really going on. So this is the frightening part. And we're also told, Glenn, which is pretty damn weird, don't worry about nuclear escalation. Don't be blackmailed by this. My advice is worry and worry a lot. And if you have been around these issues for a while, and I have for decades, and I wrote a book about the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's successful quest to negotiate a partial nuclear test ban treaty with Nikita Khrushchev, you know, if you're not worried, you just don't get it, because you better be worried. And I'm very worried about this administration not getting it.
You know, it was such a staple of Cold War culture, Cold War policy, that avoiding nuclear war was the single greatest priority as we were going around the world with these proxy conflicts against the Soviet Union. We managed never to directly engage them militarily. And even then, misperception, miscommunication did bring the world close to nuclear annihilation, at least on 2 occasions, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And yet it really does amaze me that we seem to have just kind of through, I don't know, inertia or lethargy or historical ignorance come to view the risk of nuclear war as basically a fiction, as kind of assigning zero value to it, or even this kind of macho attitude that we're not going to be deterred by a country having nuclear weapons. Talk a little bit about, you know, in the time that you've been working in all the things that I discussed in these kind of geopolitical framework, even from an economics perspective, the specter of nuclear war and how it used to be kind of important for people and policymakers in deciding what they would and wouldn't do.
You know, there was one moment when Biden was caught on tape saying, you know, we're on a path to Armageddon. This is, I think it was the fall of 2021, if I remember.
No, 2022.
2022,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 2022, excuse me. And, you know, he was excoriated by the press the next day, rather than anybody reflecting, oh, my God, the president of the United States is saying this. He was excoriated. How dare he say this? You know, he let a tiny glimmer of the truth in. And then, of course, the whole idea was shut that up. Don't talk about that. Well, anyone that knows some history, and by the way, if you want to know some history, the most wonderful book written about this by a great historian is a book called Gambling with Armageddon by a late, great historian, Martin Sherwin, who wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the whole atomic age, in fact. And the book is terrifying because we came so close 60 years ago, actually 61 years ago now, to nuclear annihilation. And almost every one of Kennedy's aides would have pushed us to that. We fortunately had a president who had the sense to avoid the ultimate disaster, but almost none of his aides had that sense. And what Sherwin recalls, and what we've learned from Dan Ellsberg and from so many others, is how close we've come and how easy it is to come close because there's so many stupid people in our government. Believe me, this is something I can tell you absolutely. People who don't think, who are extraordinarily lacking in basic common sense, who believe that power is the only coin of the realm, who believe you really do have to be tough on whatever it is, and nuclear war will see them down. And all of this is extraordinarily reckless, and we're really in it now. And it's, of course, not just Ukraine. It's Nancy Pelosi flying to Taiwan. It's us doing whatever we can to humiliate China. It's having an absurd G7 meeting last week in Hiroshima, of all places, that the U.S., of course, bombed with the first nuclear atomic bomb, spending the whole G7, in essence, to attack China and Russia. They think it plays politics. They think it's a game. It's extraordinarily reckless and extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily predictable what's going on.
Yeah.
Because the real diplomats inside the U.S. have been warning about this for decades. We're only finding some of it out by WikiLeaks and by disclosures such as Bill Burns, their CIA director, who was in 2008 the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he sent a memo that everybody should read.
For Condoleezza Rice.
2008, yeah, he explained, my God, this NATO enlargement business is absolutely dangerous. And of course, George Kennan a decade earlier, and George Kennan was absolutely brilliant and understood already in the 50s how we could have gotten out of the Cold War. But certainly in 1997, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, when they still ran such op-eds, that this whole NATO enlargement business was absolutely reckless. And what's interesting, when Kennan was writing that in 1997, I hadn't actually realized it until I went back and saw a reference to an article in Foreign Affairs by Zbigniew Brzezinski that I didn't remember, writing in 1997, laying out almost the precise timetable for how we were going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. Now, this is years before Putin's president. This is when we're not having any war with Russia. People tell me, oh, yeah, well, they have to be in NATO. Look at Putin, madman. But this is well before, and Brzezinski lays out basically to the year the sequence of how it's going to be. The first row of countries, which was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. Then it's going to be the next row. Then Ukraine by 2005 to 2010, he writes, they're going to have their invitation. It turned out to be 2008. Our ambassador to NATO in 2008 was none other than Victoria Nuland. If you want to know what deep state means, she's been in every administration. She's been almost every night.
Except when Trump was elected. That's the only way, apparently, to get her out of the government.
Except Trump.
Yeah.
So she was Cheney's advisor. She was ambassador to NATO when we asked Ukraine to come in. She was the point person on the U.S. engagement in the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, which started the war in Ukraine. And she is now promoted for all of this, bringing us ever closer to disaster. And by the way, putting Ukraine in the classic place in a proxy war guaranteed to destroy that country, which is exactly what it's doing.
You know, the thing that struck me so much about that Bill Burns memo in 2008, when he was warning Condoleezza Rice and others in the Bush administration about the insanity of this plan, was he said, it isn't just Putin. You go and talk to every single person of influence in Moscow, even Putin's liberal critics, and it's all, for every last one of them, a huge red line to be mucking around in Ukraine for the West, in part because of the history of the 20th century. That's what I wanted to ask you. You gave this interview in February of 2023 with Isaac Chadner of the New Yorker, who has become this hero to the liberal establishment because of these adversarial interviews he purportedly does. A lot of it is based on how transcripts get edited, how much he gets to say, how much the guest gets to say. I've done a couple of those with him, so I know firsthand. One of the points
what a low life approach to journalism.
Completely. I mean, mine I felt ended up being pretty fair, but I've seen him done incredible hatchet jobs with others, including yours, because one of the points you kept trying to make was that the premises of his questions, embedded in them, they were almost like, when did you stop beating your wife questions, were so misguided because he was distorting the history of the conflict, in part by thinking the war began either in 2022 or even in 2014 with Crimea, and you kept pointing it out, actually the start of the war is 2013 with this change of government that he was shocked you called a coup, or even before with NATO expansion, even before it got to Ukraine. So talk about those parts of the history that the New York Times, the New Yorker editors didn't allow you to have included in that article, and why you think that history is so important to understanding how we're being propagandized about the conflict now.
Well, it's a little amazing. The New Yorker, of all places, okay, maybe I shouldn't say of all places, but Remnick's New Yorker is absolutely neocon, beginning to end. The New York Times is completely neocon. I don't know if they would be, by the way, if I can't figure it out if it's just anti-Trump, pro-Biden, or they really believe the stuff that they say, but they're absolutely unwilling to listen or to learn a fact. The thing that surprised me about Chotiner was just how he knew nothing and kept making aggressive assertions. And when you tried to say something, it was just snark. So it was a really weird experience.
Well, he's playing to that audience that loves it. Like, you know, they assume all of his assumptions that he's getting from the New York Times. That's the full extent of their worldview. You kept trying to inject an alternative historical understanding, but it never made it into the article, which is why I'd love for you to offer it now about the importance of 2013 and that change of government, and even kind of going back to when NATO started expanding after the reunification of Germany eastward toward the Soviet or toward Russia.
Well, you know, I posted a piece on Common Dreams, which people can take a look at to get a lot of the hyperlinks and a lot of the underlying data and evidence. But this story really goes back 34 years. It goes back to 1989, 1990. The U.S. and Germany were both very clear to Gorbachev, who was a godsend for the world, by the way, because he really was a man of peace, and I was profoundly honored to try to help him on the economic side, though the White House was having none of it at the time. But in any event, Gorbachev believed in peace, and he unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet side NATO, and Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated time and again to Gorbachev, and in many, many different forms, and so did the NATO Secretary General and others, we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. We won't do it. Now, I spoke to a wonderful historian who is working on this right now, who tells me that in the archives he's come across in 1992, not only the plans for NATO expansion, but Ukraine already on the list for NATO expansion in 1992, when supposedly in the public there is no such thing as NATO expansion at all. But remember 1992, that was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld in the Bush senior administration. I thought, what could be worse? Well, we kept learning things can get worse. Right. Even in the Democratic Party, the love affair with the so-called liberal hegemony. I don't know what the liberal part is, but I know what the hegemony part is. That has been Nuland's thing, and of course her husband Robert Kagan's thing for decades. This has been underway since the early 1990s. Now, the Russians have been saying, and Gorbachev said, don't move eastward. We want peace. We want openness. I was actually advisor to Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. I've seen all of these people. You know what they wanted? They wanted normal life. They wanted to stop the Cold War. They did not want crazy things. They wanted normalcy. And we wouldn't give it. What we said, normalcy, yeah, that's U.S. hegemony. That's U.S. indispensable power. That's U.S. we do what we want anywhere we want when we want it. And that has been the story all along. And frankly, I couldn't imagine it at the time because I was watching with my own eyes as a young guy. Suddenly, the world had a chance for peace. And peace didn't mean U.S. global hegemony. Peace meant normal cooperation, but we couldn't accept the deal of just being normal and cooperative. We had to say, now we lead on everything. And that's been the story since the beginning. Now, there are many steps to it. Clinton was the first violator of the promises, and Clinton's so inconsistent on everything, but this is one of the things he was inconsistent on. So the first NATO expansion took place under Clinton, and that was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. The next NATO expansion, 7 countries by Bush Jr. in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. So you had the Baltic states, you had Romania and Bulgaria. You're starting to, right up against Russia, Slovakia and Slovenia. Now, Putin says in 2007, stop already, stop. He says it in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. We don't listen at all. 2008, Bush says NATO is going to enlarge to Ukraine. The European leaders, by the way, were aghast. And one of the European top leaders at the time called me, said, what is your president doing? Of course, European leaders don't say any of this publicly, but they say privately, this is crazy. This is so dangerous. But of course, they were quiet. Bush pushed this through in 2008. Then there was a reprieve for Ukraine. The reprieve was that the president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, look, we're in between 2 giants. We don't want to be smashed in the middle. We take neutrality. But neutrality was a red flag for Victoria Nuland and her friends. And so at the end of 2013, when demonstrations against the decision that Yanukovych had made to postpone signing an agreement with EU started protests, believe me, the U.S. covertly and overtly and every other way stirred that up massively. But in January and February 2014, they supported a violent insurrection that overthrew Yanukovych. And of course, notoriously, Nuland was caught on tape, something we don't talk about, but anyone go listen to it.
She picked the next leader. She picked the new leader.
She's planning the government weeks before the overthrow, calling exactly who would be the prime minister, by the way. It's amazing. But the whole thing is amnesia. Don't talk about any of this, so though it's so obvious. And I had a weird experience personally, which was that when the government was overthrown and Yanukovych fled and Yatsenyuk was prime minister, just as Nuland said, I got a call. Yatsenyuk wants to meet you. It's a deep economic crisis. Okay, I actually respond to those things when a government says we're in a very deep financial crisis. So I flew to Kiev, and I had an NGO brag to me about the role they played in the overthrow, and it was ugly. It left me shaking. It was, the kind of thing you just want to wash that off. Don't tell me this awful stuff. You had no business being part of a violent insurrection. But that's the role we played. I went home. I didn't go back. I was disgusted by the whole thing. But it was obvious then we were on a path towards war. This didn't start with a, quote, unprovoked invasion February 24th, 2021, sorry. No, 22, excuse me. This started in February 2014, and it started with the U.S. participation in a coup.